It was entirely unknown to the US at the time, but the infamous Cuban Missile Crisis that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war did not actually end with the agreement between the US and Soviet Union in October 1962. Another second, secret crisis instead brewed as at least 100 other tactical nuclear weapons remained in Cuban hands, entirely under the radar of US intelligence. Springing such a surprise would be the ultimate US deterrent, and Cuban leader Fidel Castro was not going to give up his firepower easily. Castro's preoccupation. It should be remembered that Cuba's communist leader Fidel Castro was paranoid about an American invasion of his island country. The US had opposed Castro ever since the successful Cuban Revolution swept him to power on New Year's Day 1959. The US had made several attempts, overt and covert, to undermine and overthrow the Castro government. These efforts reached a peak with the botched attempt by American-backed rebels to overtake the country at the Bay of Pigs on April 17, 1961. It was an infamous and humiliating event for the US, which saw Castro remain triumphantly in power, but Castro remained highly anxious about an American invasion. 14 very dangerous days. Cuba and the Soviet Union agreed in July 1962 to allow the Soviets to deploy their nuclear missiles on the island. For Castro, it was a buffer against what he believed was US aggression. For the Soviets, it meant having nuclear warheads less than 100 miles from the US mainland. The Soviets also had another reason for deploying in Cuba. It meant they could level the atomic playing field. Until then, America had had the upper hand as they could launch their missiles from Turkey and destroy the USSR before the Soviets could even react. Now, with missiles placed in Cuba, the Soviets had finally established what was known as mutually assured destruction, the meaning of which is chillingly clear. The US responded with due alarm. On October 14, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane flew over Cuba and produced clear photographic evidence of medium-range SS-4 and intermediate-range R-14 ballistic missile facilities in Cuba. The US would establish a naval blockade against Cuba on October 22, 1962, to prevent new missiles from reaching the island country. The Americans further demanded that Soviet weapons already on the island be dismantled and returned to the Soviet Union. During all this time, the Soviets publicly denied any claims that they had missiles on the Caribbean island, but things came to a head when Adlai Stevenson, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, spoke before the UN Security Council on October 25, 1962. He accused the Soviets once again of them having missiles in Cuba, which the Soviets shrugged off yet again. Millions watched on television as Stevenson unveiled poster-sized black and white photographs of the reconnaissance undertaken a week earlier by the U-2 spy plane. The Soviets had been caught out. The Cubans and Soviets saw the resulting U.S. blockade as an act of war, and Soviet ships laden with more missiles made their way to Cuba. The two superpowers vowed to engage if the Soviet ships breached the U.S. line. The world held its breath. Until the weekend of October 27th and 28th, a period judged by history as the time that the danger finally lifted, when a deal was struck between Kennedy and Khrushchev to withdraw the Soviet missiles in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba. The U.S. also agreed to the secret withdrawal of nuclear weapons deployed in Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis was supposedly over. Khrushchev's cunning plan. Behind the scenes, however, the real threat never really passed. Unknown to the U.S. at the time, there were 100 other nuclear weapons also in the hands of Cuba. This would spark a frantic and ingenious Russian mission to recover them from the Cubans. But why were the missiles there in the first place? It turns out they were part of a plan by Khrushchev to allay Castro's wounded pride and to offset widespread Cuban indignation over the concessions Khrushchev had to make with Kennedy for a nuclear showdown to be averted. Castro had been unceremoniously cut out of the main negotiations between the superpowers over the fate of the Soviet missiles stationed in Cuba. The notoriously proud and mercurial Cuban leader, in turn, vowed to begin ceasing cooperation with Moscow. This development alarmed the Soviets as they wanted and needed Cuba as an ongoing ally in the Caribbean, right on the doorstep of the United States. The consolation prize given by the Soviet Union to Castro was to provide Cuba with more than 100 tactical nuclear weapons that had been shipped to the island along with the long-range missiles. Crucially, these had passed entirely under the radar of the U.S. intelligence at the time, leading up to the crisis. Khrushchev concluded that because the Americans hadn't listed the missiles on their list of demands, then it could be assumed that the interest of the USSR would be well served by keeping said tactical weapons in Cuba. Anastas Mikoyan, the smart Soviet. The Kremlin's number 2 in command, Anastas Mikoyan, was charged with making the trip to Havana to make a deal with Castro. His mandate was to calm Castro down and make him what seemed like an offer the Cuban leader couldn't refuse. Mikoyan knew that the future of relations between Cuba and the Soviet Union was on the line. Shortly after arriving in Cuba, Mikoyan received word that his wife, who had been very ill, had died. Even so, he pledged to stay in Cuba and complete negotiations with Castro. Mikoyan had his work cut out as he negotiated the deal with Castro. He was subject to the Cuban leader's substantial mood swings and paranoia. Castro continued to be convinced that Moscow had sold Cuba's defense right down the river with the Americans. Castro was furious at the Soviets. Castro's primary objection was the non-stop flights over Cuba by American surveillance aircraft. Mikoyan was horrified when he heard Castro declare that he had ordered Cuban anti-aircraft gunners to fire on these American aircraft. Mikoyan knew only too well what a downed American plane would do to the fragile truce the Soviets had just made with the Americans. It was Mikoyan who came to a personal decision that under no circumstances should Castro and his military be given control of the Soviets' weapons. These were weapons, by the way, with an explosive force equal to 100 Hiroshima-sized bombs. The dark arts of diplomacy came to the fore on November 22, 1962, during a tense 4-hour meeting between Mikoyan and the Cubans. In short, Mikoyan lied through his teeth. He stated to the Cubans how it would be in breach of an unpublished Soviet law to transfer the missiles permanently into Cuban hands and provide them with an independent nuclear deterrent. The thing is, the law Mikoyan spoke of didn't actually exist. Yet Castro bought the lie and agreed to relent on the issue. The tactical nuclear weapons could finally be created and returned by sea back to the Soviet Union during December 1962. Soviet archives would later show that the relief and joy at this outcome by Khrushchev and the Soviet Politburo was palpable. A stale stalemate. It's important to remember that the compromise reached by the US and Soviet Union had satisfied no one. It was an embarrassment for Khrushchev and the Soviet Union, who were portrayed as retreating from circumstances they had started. It's no coincidence that Khrushchev fell from power just 2 years later. Furthermore, the Soviets couldn't even make public the withdrawal of US missiles in Turkey. The Americans had insisted on that. The US wasn't happy either, viewing the agreement as a capitulation, while the Cubans felt they had been betrayed by the Soviets. Even US President John F. Kennedy had taken it personally. A year after the crisis, and just days before his assassination, Kennedy was still speaking of what he called the, quote, unfinished business from the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's also important to note that Kennedy and his advisors simply didn't trust the Soviets. This arose both before and during the crisis, especially as the Soviets kept denying their missiles were in Cuba. That mistrust even continued after the agreement, with the Americans wondering if the Soviets would indeed withdraw the weapons. How the truth came to light. All of this astounding secret Cold War history was uncovered in November 2011 by English journalist Joe Matthews and Russian journalist Pasha Shilov. Their findings would change the whole perspective on the Cuban Missile Crisis and how much they thought they knew about it. Both journalists had grown up in the shadow of the Cold War, and both knew how frightening the accounts of the crisis were, be they from the Western or Soviet points of view. Their investigations took the two journalists to St. Petersburg and the Soviet Submariners Veterans Society, as well as the National Security Archive in Washington, D.C. It was Svetlana Savranskaya, the director of the Russian archives, that told the two men the incredible story of how the missile crisis extended for weeks beyond the October deadline. In their opinion, the real hero in this secret Cuban Missile Crisis was Anastas Mikoyan. The Soviet politician had used his cunning and ability to judge a potentially explosive situation and to avoid what could have been a catastrophe. The Cuban Missile Crisis did create something positive between the two superpowers, the creation of the famous hotline. This is a direct communication link between Moscow and Washington, D.C., to allow leaders to communicate directly to solve any future crises. Was the U.S. really in the dark? The secret Cuban Missile Crisis came about through an unnerving and perilous mix of Soviet duplicity, American intelligence failures, and the temperamental character of Fidel Castro. It is also worth noting that U.S. forces around the world remained on DEFCON 2, one short of global nuclear war, until November 20th of that year. Did the Americans perhaps know more about the Cuban-Soviet deal than they had led on to this day? The timeline is telling, though, since the Cubans only agreed to allow the Soviets to dismantle all of their weapons and return them to the USSR 2 days later, on November 22nd. It's entirely possible that the US didn't know anything at all about the secret threat in its own backyard.